Welcome to the Global SciComm Meetup. And this edition is Plural Perspectives in Science Communication. Today we have Ayumi Koso and Thilina Heenatigala, both based in Japan. Now, Ayumi is director of the National BioResource Project and Public Relations Office, National Institute of Genetics. And she co-founded an organization called Japan SciCom Forum in 2018 to build a platform that brings together science communicators from across of Japan, and particularly engaging in the English language. She'll tell you more about herself. Thilina is an assistant professor and director of communications at the Earth Life Science Institute, also known as ELSI, in Tokyo. And I first met him talking about issues of decolonization, actually, and he's involved in the astronomy community. So I'm not going to speak too much because they can describe to you who they are themselves. So again, if you have any questions for any of our speakers at any point, and I have to remember to slow down just in case people don't speak English as their first language. So if you have any questions for any of our speakers, please do just put them in the chat and we will get across to answering them. So without me talking anymore, I'd like to hand it over to our speakers. And I think I'll first start by speaking to Ayumi. And if you could please tell us about the Japan Science Forum.
Right. Thank you for the introduction, John, and thank you for the invitation to be part of the community and to share my perspectives from Japan today. So, as John just explained, I am a public relations practitioner and also researcher at the National Institute of Genetics, and I'm interested in how culture and language affects how we communicate science. And my background is has been mostly in institutional science communication, where I've been involved in communicating science through the media. So I have a strong media relations background. And as John kindly introduced the Japan SciComm Forum, so I just wanted to mention a little bit about why we came up with the Japan SciComm Forum, and then I think Thilina can take it on for about the actual symposium that we had in November of 2025, so last fall. So we co-founded Japan SciComm Forum around in 2018, and as John mentioned, this science communication sort of community works in the English language. So prior to co-founding Japan SciComm Forum, there were several science communication communities within Japan, in the museum sector, or the science journalists, or the medical journalists, and even institutional practitioners doing science communication in universities and research institution settings. However, the issue was that Japanese universities and research institutions and the Japanese government was trying to push universities and research institutions to go more global, internationalize, which means sort of bringing in more international faculty and students to Japanese universities and research organizations. So for that, they wanted to get the scientific achievements and outputs in the English language, which is I think the most common sort of language, which is the global language for science, and also for news and getting the message across to a wide audience. So what they did was the government was pushing for all this science communication in English and internationalization. So what the Japanese universities and research institution did at that time in the 2010s was to start hiring international staff to engage in global or international outreach. And some may have SciComm backgrounds, but some may not have SciComm backgrounds. And these people who were parachuted in universities and research institutions across Japan would be able to, I mean, obviously communicate and write and do everything in English, but they didn't necessarily speak or have the ability to communicate in Japanese. So that caused a problem of, well, it wasn't, so that caused, so because these staff were parachuted in research universities and research institutions, there wasn't really a network of these English-speaking science communicators or practitioners. And we thought that, it would be beneficial for even the Japanese staff who were also assigned to do global communications to network with all these people. And also there weren't any training opportunities, almost none in English, for practitioners to learn about the developments that are happening in the science communication field. So we came up with this idea of getting a conference launched. That was in 2018. The first conference launched in 2018. And from there, we kind of grow up into a community where we have a mailing list, where we have internships, and where we have these social sort of meetups online. And that has been going on since 2018, 2019. Yeah, so it's been for about 7 or 8 years now. And we've had the annual conferences for that. And so obviously we started as a domestic sort of activity, but this was in English. So we would have people from overseas to share their experiences about and we also have workshops in these conferences. So we would have a space for networking and exchanging ideas. And because because the working language was in English language, it caught the attention of other science communication communities outside Japan. And one was PCST. And I think that the language being English was a really bridging sort of had a bridging function of us to be able to bring the PCST Symposium to Japan for the first time in 2025. And I think Thilina can take it on from here about what we actually did at the PCST Symposium in 2025 and how we kind of crafted, well, how you kind of crafted all the workshops and the working groups and the discussions that we had.
Thanks, Ayumi. And hi, everybody. And thanks, John, for having us for this webinar. So even though I'll sort of present some key takeaways from the symposium, but actually, as Ayumi was sort of showing the history of JSF, even though we have this sort of a community, most of it actually based on challenges and needs of the community rather than actually thinking of it as a organization. I think that was also how it started, like thinking about challenges. And so bringing PCST there were multiple reasons. One, we wanted to have something for Asian region that we sort of can bring in people from other countries. And we have, in the past conferences, actually, if you go several years back, slowly it was, the conference started meant to be for like people in Japan, but without us sort of planning it or realizing, people in the region discovered, people in other regions like Europe discovered it, and they sort of themselves came in. So that's sort of how we also thought this is a good time to actually have a symposium. But then what do we actually discuss at the symposium? We didn't want to have a venue where this is just another SciComm conference where people can come and present, which is also really important because we need more platforms for people to present their work. But the idea of this was to sort of have this conversation and how do we adopt Western science communication to move from that to what can global science communication learn from these different Asian perspectives. And I think so we had multiple different workshops working on these topics, and we divided like into two larger sort of science and society and training and education, two sort of big themes. And where instead of actually focusing on that week, we started working with smaller groups 3 months before and sort of on these topics. We work together, building up to like hosting webinars like this, and building up to the symposium. And then symposium where instead of listening to talks, we actually had these questions and topics everybody had to sort of think about and bring their knowledge into and fill these gaps. And it's almost sort of like having people to use building blocks, but using their own experience and knowledge. And eventually to produce white papers on the content we are discussing. So we explored like local knowledges, multilingual communication, this cultural responsive engagement, how that can strengthen connection between science and society, and are there even asking from ourselves, are there any differences between research and practice in Japan and China, and also looking at like models in Europe. So overall, sort of this was our perspective, sort of working on these topics. But moving, and we are still working on the content of the symposium because we are still working on the 2 papers. But one of the things is actually I ask is that is science communication universal? And can we really call science or science communication universal? Because we always tend to say like, regardless of whatever the politically happening in the world, science must go on. Regardless of what other people struggle with, science must go on. That's sort of the idea. And I myself, being both a scientist and a science communicator, I love anytime we sort of progress science, but I also have to ask myself question at what cost. And so coming back to the question, is science communication universal? I don't think sort of we have this idea that we can really call it universal, because the science communication as we understand right now, as most of us practice, is coming from the Western countries. And it has evolved in other regions much more. But I think we are at this turning point, like, how do we do it in a way that it's locally also relevant, but also globally sort of accessible? And the best example I can give is actually outside of science communication is, before I say this, I had to say that I do not support fast food, and I cannot support McDonald's, but the McDonald's model is brilliant for science, thinking about science communication. So a hamburger, every sort of many countries around the world, you can get a hamburger at a McDonald's. And that's like the main sort of like the menu item. And so hamburger is sort of like universal, and its sort of idea is global. But how they also, people at McDonald's realize, you can't just sell a regular hamburger in every country, because there's so much going on in the sense like, oh, there's a sort of idea of what are the taste is like culturally, locally, and what are the flavors, habits of eating, traditions, and expectations. So these are all sort of thought about. And so if you come to Japan, you can find this teriyaki hamburger at McDonald's. And if you go to like India, you have like this other Maharaja Mac without beef. And in Germany, you can also get beer, and then in Arab countries, you have halal menus and so on. So there's a lot of local nuance going on just to sell this one hamburger that we all understand universally. And this is exactly how we need to look at science communication, where we have a sort of understanding, how do we communicate things? How do you sort of understand science and like globally? But when we communicate and when we actually put it in practice, we have to think a bit more locally. It doesn't work the same way in Netherlands, what works in Japan, And just to expand, before I also push it back on you, Netherlands I also used to, and currently also a lot of collaborations in Netherlands, but in Netherlands we used low context communication. Everything is so direct. And in Japan we use the other way, where communication is not just through words, but like facial expressions, so many other nuances. And saying a no can be within a one paragraph that you need to figure out, is it a positive no or a negative no? So there's so many like different nuances that culturally language comes into place as well.
See, so now you took that to a wonderful place, and there's so much that I want to unpack from the stuff you said. But there's one aspect of the global and the local, and this is a big thing I always talk about. When I first was working on Global Scape projects, and we had to produce globally relevant materials, and I asked myself, what does globally relevant mean? And I immediately my brain was telling me, no, these words don't seem to make sense. You can't have global relevance that works in a local place. It has to be locally relevant. But so then I read, oh, so it's the word of glocalization, which is global and the local combined. When I looked into it, actually, glocalization is a Japanese term, not the English word glocalization, mind. I'm going to try and say the Japanese word, and Ayumi, you could tell me, like, that's not how you say it, or this is what it means. But I think the word is dochakuka. Yeah, and it's the idea of global localization, and the Western concept, or the Western concept of globalization actually originated from a practice that was from Japan. So the whole very idea of globalization and exporting businesses and taking ideas from the globe and making it local and exporting it in the same way so you could sell abroad, like IKEA as well, um, comes from Japan. And so I think it's necessarily a business or marketing term and ideology that has spread around the world and had great success. But without that influence from Japan and the business people looking across and learning that and cooperating and finding that, it would not have become an obvious thing. Whereas the Japanese people who done it, probably from their own culture, they was like, why would we not do this? This makes perfect sense. This is just how we do it. So I'm always interested in, how we learn from other cultures and peoples, and how culture affects what we can learn from other people, what we're prepared to take on, how we speak, how we talk, how we understand. Um, I've just seen something I mentioned in the comments. Claire has asked or said, I wonder if globally relevant is similar to when you ask someone who the audience for their research comms is, and they say the general public. Yeah, I think it's similar. Like for a long time, we say, how can you say general public? There's nothing general about them except that it's everything other than you. And I think this is the thing. Normally, when we talk about anything, it's normally other than your norm. And depending on where you are, that other is very varied. And yeah, I think this idea of trying to make things globally relevant, it's good for business and it's good for exporting your ideas. And it's worked very well for the typical Western world and global North and the colonizers. But it hasn't had its bad sides as well. So there are some good elements. For example, I'm speaking to you all in English now. And I would not be able to communicate with you and hear your ideas if we didn't have a common language. But I think the argument maybe necessarily comes when we value this language too much. So I think, Ayumi, you touch upon that when you say that actually it's been a credit to be able to promote an organization that communicates in English, because previously it was, I guess, a lot of it was in Japanese, you were saying. So how do you feel this has really opened up the doors for science communication in Japan, being to focus on English language communications? And one more question, if you don't mind. Do you think that has provided any limitations for doing it in English, or have you had any pushback or problems?
Right. So, yeah, so that's I think a good question. With regards to if I can just answer the pushback first, if that's okay. So because we are trying to communicate science, we're trying to communicate science in English, and the researchers can actually communicate science in English, but in their sort of expertise terms. So they aren't necessarily equipped with the sort of non-jargon way of communicating science. So the language there is not there for them. And for that reason, I think well, not some, but there is a large portion of researchers who feel not who are not confident about being, for example, if I come from the media relations part, so they don't feel confident being interviewed in English from the first place. And if it's like an online speech, it's really, really stressful for them. So I've heard that when international reporters try to interview the Japanese researchers in English, they will rather use email and have the responses back in email, because then the Japanese researchers would have more time to think about their responses, and they can correct their grammars and everything, and they can have they can be more confident about what they're responding. So that sort of communication by email seems to be working more than the one-on-one sort of communication style of interviewing a researcher. And I think most of the times when you look at the media relations sort of practices in the sort of, and I'm not sure if it's a Western context, but the English language context, they interview journalists or reporters prefer an online sort of on-the-spot spontaneous comments, right? Because it's more lively, and it sounds more like the researchers actually, talking within that sort of article that you're producing. But that sort of liveliness is kind of taken away once it's in email, so they don't prefer that writing. But then again, for Japanese researchers, because of these English language confidence and abilities, and their sort of capacity to communicate in English is not at the same level as a native English speaker. I think that is one way to kind of circumvent the difficulties that arise with language. And if that option were not there, I think there would be less sort of less interest in the researchers to actually be involved in English language science communication, because it's really stressful. And I was talking to John about the Japanese sort of system being really sort of planned out and on time, and they're quite rigid, and they like to be structured in every sort of way. So for example, when there are media relations requests to a science from a science reporter to a scientist at a Japanese university or research institutions, most likely Japanese researchers will ask for the questions to be sent beforehand so that they can be prepared. Even though this is in Japanese, this is like a practical sort of practice that they've put it in. So that the scientists can feel confident about what they're going to talk about, so they can be prepared and be planning about what they want, how they would be portrayed in the media. And I also did the same and asked John before our session, saying, well, what would you be asking about? Because I'm really Japanese, and I'm not a native. My language, my English is a second language, so I'd like to be prepared. And that sort of sense also, I think, is held common among scientists in Japan, and they like to be well prepared and want to know what will happen and kind of predict what would be happening within the interview, because this is such a different task from what they're actually doing in the lab or within the university. And that sort of asking for questions beforehand to an international reporter doesn't really work out either. So if I sometimes mediate between international reporters and scientists. But if that request comes out from the scientists, obviously the reporter would not be interested in kind of giving out the questions beforehand. And then there's a tension between the scientist and the international reporter. So that can kind of cause like a pushback from the scientist as well as a reporter. And so those are the things I think that language has an effect on how media relations is done here in Japan, and when you try to go global. And I think there are really other sort of small differences that can come and play. And another thing I wanted to mention, it's not about language. I think it's more about culture. And I really am aware of the deficit model about, the one-way sort of knowledge transfer from the expert to the lay public sort of model. And it's criticized for not being sort of engaging the audience and not being able to kind of affect the sort of perceptions of, of the people who are being talked to. But I find that in Japan, the schooling system is more like a deficit model. And I think the Japanese people are used to kind of being in a classroom setting where there's a teacher and the teacher talks to the student and the student is kind of expected to listen quietly when the teacher is speaking and to only ask questions when asked to, sort of thing. So it's not really, it's within the culture or the schooling system, because they're trained in that way. Sometimes when you have like a Western sort of style of a workshop where you're supposed to kind of where you are expected to give your ideas or your perspectives on something, sometimes it doesn't work out because people are more expected to be kind of taught or being directed to being given sort of knowledge in a way, in a deficit model sort of way. So sometimes I think sometimes in Japan that deficit model does work in a sense, and I think we can't really kind of deny or disregard that in the Japanese context. So those are the sort of two observations I've kind of had, and maybe Thilina can take it on from there. Or yeah, if you have any more questions, John.
Yeah, no, please, over to
Can I
Thilina. And I was just going to
also
mention
add,
that it's really interesting. So please do, Thilina.
yeah, to actually add to what Ayumi was expanding, one of the other things that whenever we mention like localization or local aspect, we immediately think of language. And that's sort of like the high point. Oh, if you are thinking about localization, it should be language. So you do things in Japanese. But I think the localization is much more bigger and broader than that. When we say localization, it's actually a little bit more nuanced, like how people behave, how people understand things, grasp things, and what are the practices that are being currently used. And one example I can give you is that in Western medicine, we often use like terminology like disease, pathology, diagnosis, treatment. And all of us sort of understand these now. But in Ayurvedic medicine that practice in South Asia, we use actually terminology that are closely translated in English as like balance, harmony, constitution, well-being. But if you mention these, then you are in a Western mindset. You are thinking about not actual Ayurvedic medicine. You're thinking about well-being as a something completely different that is currently being sold. It could be like a meditation or something, but not actually a medical treatment. And so that's why we have to figure out, like, we have to sort of understand that whenever somebody says localization, it's more than a language. It's where they come from, where are we, who's our publics, and so on. I think somebody even on the comment mentioned this, that public is plural, and we'll always have, even within our community, multi different public coming into whatever the event that we are doing.
Yeah, so absolutely. And I think two things struck me there. And the first one I would point out was the three classically repeated models of science communication, deficit, dialogue, participation. And obviously, when it comes to communication, it's kind of, as humans, we kind of do whatever works. And so the way I always vision this is if you do go to a country and you don't speak the language, but you need to get somewhere, you watch two people trying to communicate to each other how to do that. Like, I need to go to the toilet, it's that way. And they will find a way to communicate that message despite the language differences. And what we find in science communication, we speak about deficit dialogue and participation, and almost like one is worse than the other. But I think it's more telling people to don't make assumptions of your audiences and that what you say will naturally resonate with them. I think that was the problem with the deficit model, the assumption that just by talking with people that would change their views and opinions and get support. I think more realistic is to say that work out your audience, see what works best for them, then use a method that works for them culturally and normatively. So for example, it might be a cultural norm that the deficit model or a deficit idea or a deficit approach or one-way communication is more received by them. And trying to set up a participatory activity would require thinking it from a different perspective. You couldn't take something that was done in England or the Netherlands or America or even South Africa or wherever and say, yes, we're going to use that here. You need to understand people's cultural norms. And I personally think the best way of that is by working with people from that country who understand the norms from a first place perspective. And I believe everyone is an expert in their own perspective and where they're from. And so you should incorporate them. But that kind of comes back to the education system, because sometimes there aren't as much opportunities for people to rise to those positions from those localities. But we do have that for many places, and I think that's where science communication is flourishing now. Language, partly, I want to break from language, but I wanted to point out that it's interesting that some nations are colonized, or colonial nations. For example, I'm from the West Indies, and my grandparents and great-grandparents, they weren't native to the West Indies like they were, but originally we were brought across. Whereas the language we speak, I speak in English, I know no other language. Whereas for Ayumi, you speak Japanese, and she said it's quite homogenous across Japan. Whereas I was speaking to Thilina in Sri Lanka, there'll be multiple different local languages that people can use. And this is a real issue for science communication. When communicating to other scientists, yes, you may use the language of education, and you have the terminology that the education system has provided to the nation. But when you go out to areas where people are less access to education or systems, the lingo might not be as easy to use, the terminology, rural areas, and therefore to communicate, you need to find other means. When scientists are talking to each other, they can speak in an international language, but when you're speaking to more rural areas, you need local languages. And beyond that, you need to understand the local cultures. And so, Thilina, I'd like to ask you, you have an interesting background. When we talk about science communication in Asia, obviously we can talk about the Japanese context. We can talk about this thing of maybe an Asian context, if there is such a thing. Can you have a continent context, or does it have to be more local to a country or maybe to a region? But Thilina, you have experience from Sri Lanka, Japan, the UK, the Netherlands. So how do you feel this has affected you culturally and how you choose to communicate and the way you view communication?
I think the more, I grew up in Sri Lanka, then some of my studies and work in UK, Netherlands, Portugal, US, and now in Japan for 8 years. And you might see, okay, that surely a wealth of knowledge, experience. But I think what happens is actually I end up with more questions than answers, because of more sort of complicated, like I have a little bit of from how we communicate, do things in Sri Lanka, and a little bit from Dutch, a little bit from English, and now from Japanese. And so I wouldn't even call myself like I'm an expert and I don't know how to communicate in terms of how we do things in Japan. And it's sort of like a blessing but also a challenge where I think we need to figure out at some point, how do we sort of understand some of the key things, because earlier we were talking about deficit models and so on, and most of these models right now that are in practice or outdated came from the West. But can anyone name a science communication model that came from India? More than 1 billion people, and most of them come across science at some point. And is there a science communication model that we know about? What about in China? More than 1 billion people, and why not? So I think my personal goal, and also maybe from at some point for JSF, is that we try to sort of find these local nuance that actually really works, and then can we transport that into another audience in another country that actually can work in a different way. And but we have to also be very careful, because I don't really want things to happen what happened with tea and what happened with yoga. Like if you go to UK, there's Yorkshire tea. There's no tea, a single plant of tea growing in Yorkshire. That tea comes from somewhere else. And there's nowhere in Switzerland they are growing cocoa. So the Swiss cocoa comes from somewhere else. And nobody that actually traditionally practiced yoga has ever worn a yoga pant. But that became a multi-billion-dollar industry. So we have to also find ways, like not pick and choose like the things that you like and then completely westernize it, and then present it to the audience, and then have a complete detachment from what's been happening. So I think in an ideal world, or what we should actually progress toward, is to what are the things that are working very well. That one really cool idea is that the tsunami, I don't know, maybe Ayumi knows more about this. In Japan, they found like this tsunami stones that are more than 100 years old, and that like people who lived more than 100 years already figured out tsunamis happening in Japan time to time, and they sort of put these stones so people know this is sort of like the barrier, and it's a way of science communication 100 years old. And some of the in recent like 10, even like 20 years ago, some of the tsunamis happened. People figured out you have to go beyond this point to survive. And so these tsunami stones became so popular, and like way of understanding how people communicated science like 100 years ago in Japan. And so these are sort of like things we can take, and how did that communication 100 years and still relevant today? And can we actually find that nuance in other sort of cultures and countries? And I really want to also try to sort of find ways to use whatever the practice we take from another culture, the local word for it, rather than we like use a different word. Because a lot of the times, John, you mentioned decolonizing earlier, and I work on decolonizing science. And a lot of the science is that if the name of the person attached to it has a difficult name that pronounce, then it becomes like a English term, where if the discovery comes from the West, then the English word is fine to use. So in generations of using these, then we sort of lose that connection to each other culture. So I think, coming back to your question, it's sort of find ways to sort of get best practices, if I may call it, from other cultures, other regions, and then that sort of feed into this global SciComm practices that we are already practicing a lot from Europe already.
Thank you. And we had some comments and a question in the chat. And so there was a lot of people mentioning how Ayumi, don't worry, like the idea of providing questions beforehand is actually a universal thing for many people. It's almost like a given. And I would maybe think that almost, because there is an issue sometimes with journalism and science, is that scientists tend to not go out on too much of a limb because professionally that's not kind of the best thing to do, because your whole career and your credibility can be determined by that. But what I've often found is that as a communicator working with the public and in kind of responsive situations with kids or families, sometimes they just want you to go out on a limb. They want you to respond. And when you do, they're happy and they're really forgiving. But when you're in a newspaper and it's written down for eternity, people are not always as forgiving. And I think maybe that's an element of society as it is. And you can just check the comments within YouTube videos or anything. People always have something to criticize. There will always be some people happy and some people sad. And this is the reality of, I think, the world we're in. But I do think like having questions beforehand can be beneficial for many. For me, it's good, like if I'm really scared about the conversation I'm going to have, having the areas they want to cover really settles me beforehand, and it's brilliant. But as often people have said, these questions don't always end up being the things that are covered. And I think offering the freedom to allow the conversation to kind of be flexible, I think, is the most beautiful thing. And just as a disclaimer to everybody, before we started this call, I said to both of our speakers that this conversation can go anywhere they like. So if it ends up going this way, I'm happy and I'm okay for that. But I think as interviewers or people hosting an event, sometimes we don't allow people that space, and sometimes for good reason. Sometimes you need a clear focus. Sometimes you need to be more relaxed. But I think in our role as science communicators, it's understanding when, or strategically, if we knew when it's important to really hold tight to those reins, and when sometimes we can be more free. I think if we had more strategies to when these make sense, then maybe it would kind of demystify some of these ideas. But that's just a maybe. There was another thing I noticed. It was, okay, this is a good question. And I actually have some input to it myself, but I'll hand it over to our speakers. So this question is, as culture is such a big term, what would be, for example, 3 things you would suggest looking into beforehand to start understanding the local culture? So what things might you want to consider before, when you want to understand the culture you want to communicate with?
I can give one start, and Ayumi has something to add. One of the thing that all of us, most of us in SciComm has discussed is actually trust in recent years. And since the COVID days, trust has been volatile. And however, a good question to ask about culture is like, does that culturally or locally, who do people trust? And because in multiple recent, within like last 2-3 years, studies have shown that trust in most of the world is actually increasing, despite we all feel like trust is decreasing. And trust is actually decreasing in most of the countries that are politically unstable. And this is in US, this is quite prominent. So if you are sort of doing an activity in US versus like in Japan, where Japan the trust is quite high, especially towards scientists. And except whenever there's like a big tsunami or a big earthquake, there are questions coming out. But trust is actually quite high in Japan. So you sort of need to understand when you're bringing a scientist into the group, or when you're sort of as a science communicator you are engaging, you can ask yourself, who do these people trust? And secondly, I think uh, I don't think that no one really encounters science as a blank slate. So you could sort of think about like the understanding of science among these, and what language, like especially like cultural stories and belief systems and so on. And this is really close to my field, astronomy, because in many cultures there are so many stories, so many understanding that you can sort of piggyback on the understanding. And then finally, I think you can also think about, is this are we sort of coming across, is this a sort of a culture that audience will challenge a speaker or challenge you during your session? And or is this a culture that actually listen to you start to end and then ask questions? Like I was mentioning earlier, like how in Japan we sort of like to receive things and grasp things and then sort of start work at the end. And you might find, oh, but I haven't seen that in London, or I have seen that in Amsterdam. But I can tell you, I teach in Japan, both for international students and for Japanese students. Very rarely I get a question middle of my lecture from a Japanese student. And even though we encourage like frequent discussion, and then wherein like all the international students willing to jump in and sort of get their voice heard, get their opinion heard. And so there's this cultural nuance sort of, I think from my end, those are the three things I would practice, and I would also encourage others to practice.
Thank you, Thilina. And I think we'll put it over to Ayumi, and I will kind of switch the question a slight bit as well to ask, obviously you're in media relations, and
Hmm.
so you're dealing with how to communicate with people. And I'd think, what things as well do you think people would need to know when trying to communicate with Japanese people or scientists or any particular different group? So what's your take on this, please?
So I just wanted to add on to Lena's comment about trust, and I think looking at who people trust also might be affected by if there's a hierarchy within the sort of social system. I wouldn't say there's a hierarchy in Japan, as in like a social hierarchy, but I think there is this idea of the elderly being respected more than the younger. The younger ones would be more respected. Would yeah would You would be expected to admire or be um, respecting someone who's older than you. So age does still matter in sort of the Japanese sort of system. Also, like within the university system, I find that there's a hierarchy between the faculty, the professorship who teach, and the admin staff who might be supporting all the research that goes, all the sort of admin work that goes behind the um, within the university or within the research institution. And I find that sometimes in Japan, the science communicator or the communications person within that would be allocated in the admin section. So there is obviously the hierarchy of the faculty or the professor and the communications sort of staff with being in an admin position. And obviously the faculty will have a stronger say or would have a little bit of more sort of power in their sort of position. So I think that sort of hierarchy within the social system or the society can tell you a lot uh, about yeah the culture of what you're trying to the culture that you're addressing. So who you trust. I mean, if you were a student, your professor would be someone who you would really trust. That sort of trust relationship does, I think, depend on the hierarchical system that's in place within that culture. Within media relations, so sorry, if you can kind of go back to the question, John, that you were posing me, because I kind of forgotten. Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's brilliant. It was just to say in media relations along the same thing. If I was to try and communicate in Japan, what would you say is, these are some things you might want to bear in mind if you're trying to communicate with someone in Japan?
Right. So within the media relations, I find that so in Japan still we have the media is quite strong in a sense that we have newspapers and televisions, and they're all in an organization. So there isn't that much freelancing going on compared to the sort of Western United States or the Europe sort of context. So when scientists are approached by a reporter, they can kind of figure out that someone belongs to this and so sort of media, because they would use their media organization's email address, and the email address will tell you whether they're which broadcasting company or which newspaper they're coming from. So it's quite easy to kind of figure out, oh, this is a not trustworthy, but something that you can kind of rely that they will report on as a straight news, or they can figure out if it's going to be a tabloid sort of newspaper or not. But if there's more freelancing going on, international reporters will not necessarily use the organization's email address, right? It could be a Gmail address or anything. So it becomes difficult for the Japanese scientist or the Japanese press officer who might not be familiar with those differences in work style to kind of figure out if this sort of inquiry that has come is I'm not sure if the word credible is a good word, but if this science journalist is a credible sort of science journalist who will and a credible science journalist. So in that sense, it becomes for the Japanese scientists, for the PIO, there's a lot of more work into figuring out what the science journalist has written in the past, what kind of interests that they might have. All sorts of background sort of investigation needs to kind of happen in the background for the Japanese sort of side, and which kind of takes time to kind of make the decisions of whether they want to answer in the interview or not in the first place. It might initially land in like as a junk mail because it just comes from a Gmail address and not sort of like an ACJP or COJP sort of address. So that's a missed opportunity on the Japanese side as well, because they are kind of making decisions based on the email domain address, if that makes sense.
No, that's wonderful. And it just made me think of how the initial thought was, what would we need to know about the people that we want to speak to and speak with? And it's like, actually, it works the other way, is that there's a lot of questions that they're going to have and want to answer about you as well. And this ability on both sides to answer those questions and find those answers affects how you can actually communicate between you, and so that's really wonderful. And I think we've got about 2 minutes now to the end of this main session, and so I'd like to say a big thank you to Ayumi and Thilina. It has been a really eye-opening conversation. You had some great activity in the chat as well. Again, if you'd like to find out anything more about Ayumi or Thilina's work, please do check out the Japan SciCom Forum, it's JSF, where you can see some of the work they've been doing over the past few years, maybe the past 8 years, I believe. And so I've been John Chase, and this has been a Global SciComm Meetup. So I'd like to just say thank you to everyone for attending. I don't know if Ayumi or Thilina, you want to say any final words, but for me, that's everything. So.
Yeah, maybe I can add one thing before everybody leaves. And I'm also sorry to bring McDonald's again, but the Big Mac is global. The teriyaki burger is local. McDonald's understand it needs both. So what is a science communication equivalent of the teriyaki burger? And why are we still mostly serving Big Macs? So that's a question I want everybody to think about.